Thank you, Victoria, and thanks to Hema, who couldn't be here, and thanks to Ala for engaging this. Okay, I'm going to jump in. Well, thanks to you all for coming on this gloomy day. I'm going to try and keep it lively. Ecological aesthetics and realism. Number one, literality at the origin of the realist drive. In 2016, a terrible thing happened. I started to interpret art literally. I don't know the reason why. It could have been many things. The explosive entry of the Donald Trump juggernaut into the US presidency, climate change, my own exhaustion with eco-theory. It might have been because I read a headline that the body of Annie Poutagou had been found on the bank of the Rideau Canal in Ottawa. Poutagou was an Inuit artist with an international reputation for her realist depictions of life in Kinnight, previously known as Cape Dorset, Nunavut. Her passing shook me. Demands for responsibility, sensitivity, and sensibility came crashing on my head. Why, though, should my response be to take art literally? What might it be trying to tell me that should not be interpreted? That might, in fact, be trying to shelter itself from interpretation? How does its literality change the notion of realism? Did my response come from a realist drive in the first place? I look to the scientific apparatus for a start. 2, going in deep with scientific realism. A scientific realism can be found on the Greenland ice sheet, an entity I have been studying since my literal turn. There is more than one way to read ice, though. Glaciologists harvest core samples from the depths of the ice sheet, and this can provide them with climate data that dates back to a geological time long before humans. Ice cores provide marker horizons of human history, refined information by which to read causal connections between planetary activity and cultural change. For example, when the colossal Okmok volcano of Alaska's Aleutian Islands erupted in 43 BC, it caused disruptions like drought, famine, disease, and insurrection for the civilizations living on the Nile, including the late Roman Republic and the Ptolemaic Kingdom. Such changes that span the planetary and the political can be discovered through the study of tiny pockets of air trapped in the ice that lay embedded miles beneath the surface. Core samples from the ice sheet offer a profound understanding of the entanglements of the Earth with human history. But the deep knowledge from ice cores does not necessarily connect Trump with warming oceans and the melting of the ice shelf that separates the glacial waters of the Arctic Ocean and the warmer currents of the Atlantic in Baffin Bay that is threatening to collapse an ecosystem of marine life known in Greenland as Pikialasorsuaq, the Great Upwelling. And they don't explain why Danish scientists aren't sharing their knowledge with the Inuit organization that governs over it. Ice cores don't connect climate change with the precipitous death of Annie Poutagou, and they don't explain Putin's terrorization of the Ukraine. They give no indication of how long Israel is going to besiege Gaza or how extensively its theater of war will stretch. Ice cores show us many things and explain many things, but they do not show us everything, and they don't explain everything. In fact, this pursuit of a deep planetary history through the drilling and extraction of ice may indeed obscure our vision and confuse our senses. It is hard to think straight in an extraction regime. Scientists often tell us that things are not what they seem. It cultivates a new understanding of the relationship between appearance and reality. But it does not explain all appearances. In fact, in its myopia, it sometimes neglects the most literal ones. Like, for example, that oil dumping is an act of warfare and oil spills are criminal offenses, but nobody goes to jail for them. Or that offshore drilling and ice core drilling are technologies that come from the same episteme. Or that an ice core can tell us about the eruption of Mount Okmok, but that information does not address why the surface of the ice sheet looks red like blood in its ablation zones, those areas where its edges meet the shoreline. A biologist can tell you, of course, that the red is not blood at all, but an algae bloom. This bloom, also known as watermelon snow, appears as a result of the melt of the fern layer on top of glaciers. Algae colonize the surface of snow and spread its colors ranging from pink to yellow to orange to red. Its microbiome is comprised of grazers, parasites, and symbionts. Its ecology relies on photosynthesis, the absorption of solar energy. This can compound glacier melt and accelerate the positive feedback loops associated with global warming. But for all its microscopic beauty and its playful name, watermelon snow signals the rotting of the ice sheet. It is a canary in the coal mine. Biologists show us many things about ecological relationships, but they are not answering questions about the relationship between the bloodied appearance of the ice sheet and political upheaval, either in ancient Rome, contemporary Ukraine, or in Gaza. They say nothing about the death of Annie Poutigu. This precious archive of the earth is burning and rotting, but it seems there is no real explanation as to why it is, and no clear pathway to stop it. Perhaps we need to experience it differently, possibly even more literally. Greenlandic artist Jessie Kleeman felt the ice burn under her feet in a performance I curated on the Greenland ice sheet. Kleeman started by taking her boots off so that she could feel the millions of years of ice beneath her. In only a few seconds, her feet started to burn with the intensity of the cold. She had to quickly warm them up and put her boots back on before resuming. But that was back in 2019, before the pandemic struck, before a sequence of events known as virus dumping became visible to everyone. 3. Environmental dumping. Virus dumping, according to virologist Rob Wallace, author of Big Farms Make Big Flu, is when there is an influx of capital on the market from a corporate agriculture conglomerate that puts local farmers out of business, opening the conditions for large-scale deforestation and the implementation of factory farms, the conditions under which deadly viruses are released from their home in forest hinterlands onto an animal monoculture where they rapidly evolve, producing a vector between a virus, an animal, a factory farm, a wet market, a human, an airport, and then the whole world. The coronavirus emerged from such a virus dump, the consequence of which was massive animal culls and human deaths, some more than others. But what was I speaking about when the Greenland ice sheet burned Jessie Kleeman's feet? The Greenland ice sheet is in constant motion, either melting and contracting or freezing and expanding. Its seasonal transformation is like the rhythmic pulse of a heartbeat, but paced in geological time. Despite these annual pulsations, it has shown accelerating levels of melt since 1997, a tipping point that glaciologists have identified through the measure of its surface mass balance, in which they attribute to global climate change. Sarmarswak, the Greenlandic word for big ice, is also Inuit land, a geological expanse comprising almost 80% of the world's largest indigenous sovereign territory. Today, over 90% of Greenlanders claim Inuit ancestry. Since the end of the Second World War, Greenlanders have undertaken a series of political breaks from the hegemony of the Danish realm that was established in the 18th century. Greenland achieved home rule in 1979 and self-government in 2008. This has given rise to a new social and political condition. Yet it is nevertheless one that is increasingly challenged by global warming and glacier melt in particular. The abundance of meltwater from the Gris is an ideal resource for industrial mining, forcing Greenland to navigate the pressures of multinational corporations speculating for rare earth minerals such as uranium. The Australian mining company that called itself Greenland Minerals and Energy and subsequently renamed itself Energy Transition Minerals also uses the word Lujavite to refer to the site of a large uranium deposit which is held in Narsak, southwest Greenland. They call the place by its Danish name, Kvanefjeld. Greenlanders don't say Lujavite. They know the company wants to mine uranium. They call this place, this mountain, Kuannersuit. That is its name. They don't want an open pit mine that would turn this place, this valley, its ecology, and the township completely gray. The accelerating melt of the Greenland ice sheet is an intensified symptom of a global crisis unfolding on Inuit land, and the dangerous condition of possibility for the reproduction of capitalism's system of power and profit, integrating itself into the planetary web of life. At the heart of this knot is the question of whether Greenland's self-determination and political organizations can shift the global energy resource imaginary in fundamental ways. Number 4, pain. It is with these thoughts in mind that I invited Jesse Kleeman to an interdisciplinary workshop in Ilulissat, sometimes considered the ground zero of climate change because it is here that scientists come to measure the melt of the ice sheet. Kleeman performed for our group a work called Arcticos Doloros, the Arctic in Pain, a phrase taken from the best-selling novel Arctic Dreams by Barry Lopez. The performance was the lightning rod by which the political ecology of Samarsuak could make its appearance. Over the course of the performance, Kleeman unfurled a bolt of the same black fabric she was wearing, holding it in place on one end with a string of compact fluorescent light bulbs. Then, holding up the fabric at its far edge, she turned against the wind, letting it billow out like a windsail. Her bare feet started to freeze in the thin layer of water that accumulated underneath her fabric. She had to stop and put her boots on. When she resumed, she brought out a length of rope, which she wound around her eyes and head. Blindfolded in this way, she stepped off her drapery onto the precarious surface of the ice, navigating with her arms outstretched. She then started to gather up the fabric, rope, the string of light bulbs, turning it into a tangled mess of objects. She unfolded the bundle under her robe and then cradled it as if it was a dead baby. In this world, in this work of art, the ice burned the feet of Jesse Kleeman. Sometimes ice burns and sometimes ice bleeds, or at least sometimes one experiences it that way. Because when you start putting together fragments of scientific, aesthetic, and so-called political knowledge, appearances start to change. Appearances act like messengers, and the news isn't good. 5, realism from a great upwelling of appearances. This may be a reason to think more carefully about art, but it still does not explain the need to interpret art literally. But in an ecology that is not based on the separation of disciplinary expertise or cultural epistemes, the medium is the message. While many are familiar with this famous phrase of Marshall McLuhan, it is actually a more obscure quote that pertains to my literality. He says, "Ecological thinking became inevitable as soon as the planet moved up to the status of a work of art." If the planet is a work of art, then it is perhaps not the case that I am reading art literally, but rather that I am experiencing art as planetary. These are the stakes of ecological thinking. If I were to look at Annie Poutagou's drawings, I might not see a measure of glacier melt, but I would see scenes that disclose the effects of a violent and negligent colonization of the Arctic. Climate change is an extension and intensification of the colonial apparatus. It has a specific appearance and a history in the Arctic. Yes, it looks like the disappearance of glaciers and sea ice, but it also appears in the form of hunting taxes, the resettlement of the Inuit to prefab buildings. It shows itself as sickness and suicide. As the former leader of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Sheila Watt-Cloutier, comments, "I think some people have not fully come to understand that there is no disconnect between the suicide rates in our communities and climate change." Yet if I look at Annie Poutagou's work, I would also see joy, humor, and eroticism too. I would see an example of the third generation of Inuit artists working in the Kinait co-op, and its sensibility for sulijuk, the Inuit word for realism, that means it is true. Can I read her precipitous death, an Arctic in pain and burning ice in her work? Or is it simply the case that my visual field is so distorted by war, climate change, a deadly pandemic, global necropolitics, that I am projecting such literal thoughts onto her work, projecting my own symptoms of psychosis? McLuhan's insight suggests that my lens and this art are joined in an ecology, in a common planetary condition, where artwork and ecological consciousness are one. And this is perhaps the site of my literal turn. For so long, I had been listening to a canary and enjoying its song. I had thought its song was an elegy for the dead, but I hadn't been thinking of it as a prelude to my own, nor a prelude to a mass extinction. But the canary's song about the burning of the earth's ice should not just be listened to for its beauty, nor for its melancholy. It is not a poem after Auschwitz, it is the appearance of ecological death as it is taking place, from inside the walls of such a place, from inside the walls of the earth in which we take shelter, as it burns. It is a message to the living who are about to die before we actually do die as we are dying. It is the warning, the symptom, the appearance, the medium, the message, the work and its content, the viewer and viewed, the eye and its object that tremble together at the limit of life itself, before and after death, in the heart of extinction. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Hi, everyone. Wow, it's a... Pardon? Oh, sure. Okay. Thank you so much, Amanda, for the talk. It's so powerful, and it's so nice to have you here with us at OCAD and in this context. And I feel like I need to take a breath before asking the first question.
I'll take a drink of water. Breathe.
But I do want to touch on this powerful reflection of realism and the planet as the work of art. Because I know that your theories emerge from being in these fields and being quite intimately involved. There's a real encounter. And I thought maybe we could start there, because your theories don't happen on paper. They perhaps happen as you are embedded within these landscapes and on these sites. So perhaps the first encounter of the art and showing also the performance that you were so intimately involved with. Maybe we could go back to the reality of experiencing sight and the field research that you do.
I think one thing I'll comment about being at the site, going to Greenland, I mean, the weather is always eventful. And so you don't know what's going to roll in. And in terms of, I mean, one thing I think I'm going to say is I experience the site through the performance. And that means that it's not like I'm so deeply engaged with a myth of primary experience as though I don't have a lens myself. But somehow in this encounter, by way of the performance, I can actually see my own lens. And that's really important. So there isn't this sort of, it's thrilling to go to Greenland, but it's also like you're still with your lens, right? Mm-hmm, like you still go there and you're like, God, I can't escape myself. And I think that's part of, it's really important, like if you're doing something like field research, just be aware, like you're there to do research. You're not going to just jettison your own research, and like that would be a strange posture if you were like, I'm going to go to some primordial subjectivity, or it would be the equivalent of like going native or something like that. It would be ridiculous and unethical. And so there is a way that holding a workshop, inviting people to come to the site, that's part of a mediation. And then Jessie Kleeman did her performance. I didn't even know if it was going to happen. They don't, because part of it was we flew the group in a chopper to this site called the Blue Lake, and nobody flies if it's cloudy, and it's often cloudy. But it just so happened that that day that we wanted it to happen, the weather was really clear. And so that was, everything could have conspired against this happening, and it was almost like there was just this opening. And the wonderful thing about this performance is Jessie Kleeman has shown it in so many exhibitions since then, and including a big retrospective in Denmark, but also at the inaugural exhibition of called Inua at the new Inuit Art Center in Winnipeg, and like several others since then. So So that was really nice. It's, and so I see it. It's still sort of an extension of Jesse Kleeman's performance, but at the same time, really important. Really a good experience to integrate into my own practice of research.
But it was also part of your intention for this to occur, and to occur on this particular site. You were sort of the catalyst for this movement. And I think, just to give the audience a bit of context, probably part of the reason we were put in conversation, I think both our research really has to do with these remote landscapes, and of course giving way to the power of the planetary dynamics and weather and all the sort of all the powers that are beyond your own intention. But there was an intention of this curated, choreographed moment. Can you maybe take us through how it occurred and how you conceived of this happening, and the specific occurrence of it on this particular location, and how you sort of you instigated this project?
Yeah, I mean, I did a lot of preliminary work. I mean, more than, I would say, a year and a half in advance. And then I conspired with Jeff Diamante, who was like my collaborator and who also was doing a lot of footwork. And we were both interviewing people. We did some preliminary sort of scouting out, and also just interviews with people, scientists out of Nuuk. And actually, there was one anthropologist, Lena Danielson, who she's passed away since then, but she was like, look, don't do the ice, because we've done that already. And there's a sense in which the study of the ice misses the point, some of the big political hot points in Greenland. And she advised that we go to Narsaq and look at what that uranium deposit was doing to the township, to the country, and that really is sort of, and we just followed her advice. So we held the workshop in Ilulissat after that, but because we'd sort of already been planning it, but it just changed our direction. We just changed direction altogether, and that became more, even though it seems disjoined from something like climate change. I mean, we already associate melting glacier ice with climate change. It's sort of one of these, important markers, but we saw it otherwise. And so, there's the field research, but it's not field research unless you're consulting, basically.
Right. I mean, what I think is really powerful about these works, and I think, well, hopefully we're all here, is that there's a desire for acquiring a different type of knowledge of these landscapes. And you speak about that, and you speak about perhaps also questioning or decentering the scientific knowledge, which seems to dominate the global climate change discourse, but also dominated in a particular very dystopic, very apocalyptic narrative. And it seems to be what has become the popular perspective. And I think part of the desire of some of the work that we do is to almost build a different kind of language, a different kind of lens, as you've mentioned, around it. So maybe speaking a little bit more about that. And I think I read something in an article that you wrote, is that so much of the work is not about going to a place and gathering information, but it's about a cohabitation and a presence. How does that happen, and how does it actually occur? How does this other type of understanding or perception or embodiment in that environment occur for you?
I think I feel very lucky in the sense that there was so much, things took off, but I think it's also, in Greenland itself is 50,000 people. And lots of, mainly concentrated in Southwest Greenland, but townships that are not connected by roadways. So if you fly into Kangerlussuaq, which is the major international airport, I will mention that I just heard there is now an air, First Air is flying from Iqaluit into Kangerlussuaq, I think. But now they're opening an airport. They're widening the runway in Nuuk, and there's going to be a United Airlines flight from New York to Nuuk. So one of the things that we, I saw that, it was only 2 weeks ago, and I was like, okay, the floodgates are really open. They were already open, but there was always this sort of thing, like everybody has to fly in on the same 2 flights. There's one from Copenhagen, in the summer, there's one from Iceland, and everybody's going to be coming in. And so basically you'll meet everybody you're going to meet at the, probably in Copenhagen on the way over. And there's a lot of back and forth. So it really wasn't that hard to sort of meet people. And then there's this kind of way that people, oh, do you know this person or that person? I'm, being sort of at the right, the right bar, maybe the only bar to be at on payday. And then everybody, and then you find out, oh, do you know that person? Do you know that person? And so I never felt alienated in the sense that people were. I mean, there are lots of people that are, I also heard lots of stories of other researchers feeling like they were, there's hostility towards them, and there's definitely a lot of anti-tourists. It's not like the tourist industry is not welcomed by everybody. So that's the stuff that will tear at a township. But I would say that there's something different that I'm doing from, say, there's a different, I think I'm working with a different model of justice than, say, like I think there is a kind of, I was thinking about shaping atmospheres. I noticed that you're involved with forensic architecture. And I think there's a kind of paradigm with forensic architecture that is, let's create justice through the creation of the data that we know is being obscured or hidden or simply, falling between the cracks. Let's bring that forward and then show, okay, this environmental crime has taken place. This crime against humanity has taken place. And forensic architecture has become this really important force in the art world. And I actually even approached forensic architecture about the site of Narsak, and they were like, well, they in Narsak, or maybe it's the activist organization that I got involved with, Uraninamic, which means uranium no. So there's an organization there, and they would have to hire forensic architecture to take a case. So they don't just sort of do it willy-nilly, and then there has to be funding involved with that. And so there's that, but then, and so they air this kind of, all the evidence, this injustice has happened. But then there's also listening to people in the township, getting a sense of the cultural activity and the framework and how, that's different from decolonial aesthetics, giving people a platform to speak, speak the history, maybe speak the traumas, but also really important in Greenland is this kind of optimism about the future. They got home rule. They've got the Greenlandic Parliament. They are actually in many ways trying to think about how to profit from glacier melt to support an independent nation. So it's actually like sufficiently complicated that I would say, okay, actually don't hem everything into information too quickly. Yes, it would be disastrous if an open pit uranium mine were open in Narsak, and that would be bad. But it's not the same as taking an anti-mining position either, right, which many people, like they're radically anti-extractivists. Greenlanders are not. And actually across the Arctic, Inuit organizations are, they're working with mining. But it's, where is the money going to go and how does this benefit our people? So there's a different notion of justice, and it's not that comes from dealing with people, talking to people, and understanding townships and communities, and even just language and history and so forth.
That's so interesting. Also, I think not projecting a certain type of value system when you arrive in these locations, and the complexity of the reality of economy, of their cultural history is, I think, so interesting. it's really interesting that you also reference the forensic methodology, that art can actually, I mean, I'm not sure if the entire audience is familiar, but forensic architecture, particularly as an artist collective, and they do work in a sense that where art making becomes literally evidence in the court of law. At times it renders an event or it deconstructs an event that has occurred. And so much of perhaps the work that you also do is this sort of shedding light or bringing to the foreground a narrative that might otherwise be lost. So not necessarily projecting your own value system, but kind of pasting together this forensic methodology. Do you feel, would you position this work within that lineage or?
Of the forensic? No. In dealing with realism, like I'm aware of it in dealing with realism more broadly, and the way there is something really important about bringing environmental justice out of the shadows, or bringing justice of a situation, or bringing it into appearance as a form of justice that forensic architecture does. But I was much more compelled by, not much more compelled. I would say there is something about the interactivity that comes from the lineage of performance art that Jesse Kleeman was doing. So it's, experiencing her, but also the way that she was trained as an artist, incorporating Greenlandic dance, but also sort of modes of encounter that have their history in sort of, as like colonial encounters. So really, Jesse Kleeman is very, she can be very in your face and go up and look at you. And she did another one. It's not, we filmed it, but we felt a little bit of a setup on the part of the museum in Ilulissat. They knew Jesse Kleeman was in town, and we were going to have a reception there, and they advertised that she was going to be performing there. And we had not told her that. We had, asked if they would do a performance there, and they were like, we're too small, and then they sort of sandbagged us. So I really embarrassed. I was like, Jesse, there's posters around, and they expect you to perform, and she was like, and this is, her mother lives in Ilulissat and her sister too. And so she was like, okay. And she took like a few minutes. She's like, I'm just going to go back to the hotel room. And then she came, and then she stripped off her clothes and she looked at each person in the eye, which is a very Greenlandic thing to do. This kind of like going and looking and staring down, but also if you meet a Greenlander, they might sniff you. This is a very kind of, like it's a way to, it's just a kind of, it's something that they enjoy, but also that they're known for. And so Jessie was like, and she's like, I'll give them what they want. But then she did this sort of, have me then. And so we didn't, and then afterwards, it was just a wonderful performance. But I was also like, you don't have to put it up. We don't have to do anything with it. It's yours, And she was like, don't want it. This is the one that she had prepared for and thought about and executed, and that's the one that's out there. So she uses performance, like she just, she does her stuff. But then there's also, that's not at the, it's not that the performance is, at the exclusion of other kinds of encounters that we had with other Greenlanders. It doesn't speak for other people. It is in the lexicon of art, and performance art, like post-60s performance art. It stands as that. Jesse Kleeman is Greenlandic. But there were other kinds of, when one does sort of research like this, even artistic research, there are lots of other voices that you want to take in, lots of other discomforts and worries and concerns, and it makes you question yourself. So I think the self-questioning is really important, and that's a little bit different than speaking with the authority of data like forensic architecture. So I think what I was after was a kind of a questioning of my own lens. And this is sort of one of the things that I wanted to say. I mean, is it my own lens that makes it seem this way? the affects, the pain, the trauma, all of that stuff. Is that something that I'm bringing to it? Or is it something that actually is there? And is it something that's coming from the ice sheet itself? So these, these sort of boundaries that we attempt to cross was very much part of field research question.
That's really beautiful. But what it also reminds me is this question of we're trying to perceive this very planetary scale issue. The climate issue is at a totally different scale than the subject, the human. How do you reconcile having a conversation that is at this deep time, this deep geological scale, and then bringing it to these very intimate human scale? How do you feel? I mean, I feel it's also the challenge sometimes even within my class and our conversations. How do you actually make it comprehensible, but what are the encounters that then become meaningful so we don't get lost in the scale of time and in the scale of geology? And as you say, so much is abstracted in the ice. So how does it come back to this how can it be scaled from the very human moment to this planetary issue that we're encountering?
I think there's a real, like this is where, the whole project started with, it really did start as I thought about it, like hearing about Annie Poutigu and being like, oh, no. Things have gone terribly wrong. The contemporary art world has gone wrong. Something has gone wrong here. But why? What is the sense of wrongness, and what could be done, and how does that fit together with something like climate change? And so that's where the Inuit Circumpolar Council has been quite, and Sheila Watt-Cloutier in particular, has been a really strong voice in putting those scales together. I would say that actually it's a little bit difficult from, say, a Southerner's lens or a settler lens or something like that, a European lens, is that there's like a will to abstract. And even, this is why I would say like science itself is a kind of abstraction, but climate change is experienced in and through people in Arctic communities, or at least this is something, that Annie Poutigu, like you wouldn't look at these drawings and say climate change, and yet Sheila Watt-Cloutier would and does, right? And so there's something, this is what I try to wrap my head around, like that actually, I just became quite interested in the idea that our environment, the psyche is actually an environment, and it's a kind of, that there is this sort of interaction with the environment, and you can read your own psyche in the environment as, as having this communication all the time. But what is it that, how is that going to play out is a question. So yes, take literally, like it literally is, woman breaking bottles, or first tourist, or Dr. Phil, or summer tent, or something like that. Yes, it is these things, but and we should see those things. So we should not, in a sense, seeing art literally in the sense of Sulijuk is, well, don't abstract. Yes, it is these things, but it's not that these things are not entangled. They are, but don't be so quick to cast aside Dr. Phil and climate change or something like that. So there's a real challenge of like seeing the bits and pieces, seeing the fractures, but seeing them together and being like, oh, okay, this is what we're working with.
I'll ask one more question and then open it up to others to ask. There's something that's always on my mind and entering these landscapes is remote locations. It's the contradiction I often feel in trying to do environmental work and our very presence maybe being contradictory to that work. The fuel we burn to arrive in those locations, or perhaps even the extraction of the artwork from those locations. I think about it maybe in two different ways. One is, should artists get sort of this free pass of entry, to be able to bring back the image or to bring back a moment of experience that becomes an incredibly powerful lens. Because of course you talked about scale and tourism. If these locations are suddenly opened up to mass tourism, they will ultimately be at risk of some of the things we're concerned with. So what do you think? Should the artists working within the environment also be beholden to some of those issues? A few years ago, actually, I met an art patron in Switzerland that was supporting an artist friend, and she supports a group of artists as well as scientific expeditions on helicopters to remote locations. And I just kind of couldn't wrap my head around the contradiction of burning fossil fuel, getting on the helicopter, entering those remote locations. And I still don't really have an answer to it, but I wonder, should the artist and the artist studio be responsible? Much is the public, or should there be maybe a different exception?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question because so many residencies are like residencies on a freighter ship, or you know, like, and actually artists, like the demands on them to actually be dislocated and to be on, you know, to be, you know, traveling through these throughways that are, it's challenging to, and to make something of them. You know, let alone the question of, you know, burning fossil fuels for research. Nobody ever has that criticism of a scientist, but you know, somehow people in the arts and humanities have to bear that question. I always say, if you really care about that, become a vegetarian and then we'll talk. But you know, it's not a moot point because one wants to be consonant with one's values. But one thing I'll say about, I'll say something about the artists of Kenite, because this is something that I think as very successful about Kenite. So, you know, the artists at the co-op, they're now in a sort of, Annie Putugu would be considered third generation. They're now in a fourth or fifth year generation, and I went there last year to Kenite, and they were preparing to send work by about 14 different artists and young people too to Korea. They were sending the artworks to Korea for a big exhibition. And so it seemed to me, I was like, the world wants, the world cares about the Inuit, and they want these, you know, they want these drawings and prints, and they want them exactly because of Sulejuk, because of the realism. They want to, you know, because in a sense, because they have that dimension. They want the lineage of it, the generations, but they also want the feel of the co-op. And there's a way that as a group of, like, as a generation of young artists, they're able, you know, and that work travels the world. The artists themselves, maybe one or two of them might go, but the co-op, you know, that's for the co-op. It's very difficult to travel to Kenite. I mean, I did it, but and like every flight was canceled, and I arrived like 3 days late. And why do I privilege the encounter and that sort of thing? And I had wanted to meet Shubhanaya Shuna, and that's another sort of, you know, that's another dimension of my research, and that was wonderful, and to see. So as an art historian, super important. But I'm aware of, actually let the art world handle some of that stuff in a way that the scientific world does. So let the traveling of art and its capacity to speak be part of the system, rather than sort of, you know, in the sort of tradition of the explorer, sending out artists to go. And yet, all over Greenland, there are lots and lots of artists who are taking, especially sound samples, but also taking like soil samples. And I mean, we, Jeff Diamanti, who I was collaborating with, like, we both took rocks, and he got stopped at the airport. And yeah, it was really just like security was very light, and it was just somebody was like, take out those rocks, because they know that that Australian mining company, they take samples and they take, they take samples of rock, like geological specimens. And so it was politically charged in a way we didn't know. Like on that trip, we were not quite so aware of that uranium mine and how charged even just a rock would be. We were just like, yeah, that's, here's some rocks. So actually, to me, the sampling, like the traveling out and the sampling, that is a big part of sort of artistic research. It's becoming more charged than ever. And I don't have categorical answers for it. But I'm aware that, actually that does put pressure on something like forensic architecture in the sense that, a little piece of truth or something like that to produce a forensic analysis is not necessarily like forensic architecture. They're an organization again, and they've got a bigger picture. They're doing an analysis, but what does it mean if you don't have the analysis yet and you're just sampling? And that suddenly it can look a lot like a kind of it can be like salvage anthropology. I'm saving this before, or like the consciousness of it is not so it's not so cut and dry. I'll say that.
I think it's really good to keep these questions complex.
Yes.
I also don't have a good or bad answer to it, but I think it is the contradictions that haunt us anyhow. Maybe I'll open up to the audience if anybody has a question or comment.
Request before you respond to the question, if you could just repeat the question for the mic.
Sure, I could do that. Yeah, sure. There's two questions. Maybe one behind you and then, yeah, go ahead. Yes, you.
Hi, thank you for your talk today. I'm Lucia.
Actually, I could also pass the mic.
Yeah, it's true. You could just speak.
Sure. Okay. Hello, I'm Lucia. I'm the Alumni Relations Coordinator here. We wanted to come today to see the talk and support our colleagues and support on-campus programming and all that. And my question, it's, I guess, kind of a question, kind of a comment around, first, in your presentation, there's a combination of the illustrative works as well as the photographic, documentary pieces from the performance. And so for me, just kind of bringing up questions around when we're talking about realism or being literal in artwork, it's, I guess the choice of medium, and maybe your thoughts around the choice to document the performance through photography versus another medium, or that sort of thing. And then the other part, just thinking about in the conversation around export. And so when works are being made for export, how does that maybe change our understanding of them, or considering the audience in who are these works meant for? Because my assumption is it's not maybe for Greenlanders because they're living in this place and know it in a more intimate way than I do as someone in, Southern Ontario, and yeah, blah, blah, blah. I don't know if that's not really a concise question. I guess it's around medium in terms of literalism, and then also kind of the role of audience and export when we're thinking about works from an environmental perspective.
Yes, I find this question, I find the gap between, say, prints and drawings from Kinite and someone like Jesse Kleeman, performance artist, I found that really noticeable. And because I sort of set the umbrella of my own research as circumpolar north, but specifically I was thinking about, Inuit peoples, but there's a big difference between, just historically, Even though, at one time it was, like if you go far enough north, it's only like 400 kilometers that separates sort of Arctic Canada from Greenland, and that would have been traveled by kayak, and it no longer is. But when I went to Ilulissat, there was an exhibition of Kinite prints and drawings, and so the idea of there being circumpolar North Inuit is there, and there's meant to be a communication. But what happened with Greenlanders is that the generation, like Jessie Kleeman would be in her, I think she's about 63, so she's in her early 60s, and that generation of Greenlanders were sent to be educated in Copenhagen or in Denmark, and then returned to the townships. And that created, there were all kinds of problems, but a little bit different from residential school system and the kinds of displacement that happened in Canada. But one of the things that when artists were, or people were sent and then they were sort of educated as artists in Denmark, there were different, some of them were like trained to be printmakers in a model that's very similar to what happened in Kinite, that there would be sort of these trade co-ops. And the art was meant to be tourist art, or like it meant to be sold to Southerners in the first place. That's what happened in Canada. In Greenland, there were like a few sort of artist directors who were teaching performance art, and so artists like Jessie Kleeman were encouraged to do performance art and to get into the whole, not so differently from someone like Amanda Boetzkes or other performances artists of the 70s and 80s. So that happened. But I heard Jessie Kleeman sort of have like she said something about. There was another print artist. She almost didn't want to be associated with it, and there is a little bit of that sort of double consciousness, like I'm a Europeanized Inuit, so I don't want to be associated with the, with sort of a different kind of Inuit or something like that. But then Jessie Kleeman fully uses that. Cultural shame as an integral part of her performance art, and she'll use like seal blubber and and actually works in connection with cultural theorists who talk about the sense of shame about being Inuit. So that's sort of there in the practice. So Jessie Kleeman's art is like, everybody knows Jessie Kleeman too, and so in a sense her work is for Greenlanders, and I would say the print always was in the first place, sort of to send, it's almost like here's what's happening down here. And Annie Poutigu in particular was like, I'll give you realism. You want to know what's happening in Kinite? Here you go. It's not just hunting. And so she was, that's why there's a kind of generational separation. Like, yeah, well, I'll take that notion, which has been written about, by anthropologists, and is very much about sort of honing medium to tell a story, or, Sulujuk has been applied to carving as well. So it's about the integrity of materials, and that's sort of translated into storytelling. So the storytelling, Inuit storytelling is fascinating. There's a lot of sort of enchanting, but then creating a mystery, but then being like, this is true, and, and there's a specific Greenlandic structure to it too. One that doesn't, can't perfectly be patterned onto performance art by any means, and it's not perfectly patterned onto print either. So this is just to say, these are diverse practices, but I would say that they are being exhibited at, like Annie Poutigu, Liverpool Biennale, entered into the world stage. Same with Shuvanaia Shuna, now at the Venice Biennale. Documenta, and this, this exhibition in South Korea, and Jessie Kleeman too. Like, this is Inuit art becoming global, and having these, having quite disparate roots, but being for a global audience. And for that reason, I could say we could read it in relation to climate change. It's a complicated question. I hope that touched on a few things. Sorry, I'm over talking.
Thanks a lot. Hi, my name is Doreen, and although I'm over here in Toronto visiting family, I live in Brussels, and I work for a European environmental organization that is a climate organization. So maybe my question is going to be much more about the practical side of things, having heard that also at OCAD that there is work with activists. That's exactly where I sit, let's say, in constructing policies going forward. And I think you touched upon, and also what came through the initial conversations that were, the introductions that were starting to happen from the audience side, is the more systemic approach that we need, or view that we need to take to things like climate change. We can't just keep talking about greenhouse gas emissions, and actually the question is for both of you. We can't keep narrowing it down to technology will save us. We can see that what's happening with the whole energy transition. And I'm not a climate expert. I'm actually, I'm much more on the natural resources and what we call circular economy. And so I come into a climate world which I consider actually quite, for want of a better way to describe it, is quite autistic, as in GHGs is all that we can think about. How do we reduce GHGs? And who cares really about, we can't deal with mining. We need to push this energy transition because renewables will save us. And so we destroy the planet to save the climate. This is where we're going. And industry is pushing for that as well, because that's where the economics are. They'll get the investment, they'll get the money, they'll get the subsidies for technological change. So how in the work with activists, where it's easier to take a much more holistic point of view, perspective, and draw different issues together and create images and bring experiences to people so that they can understand that systemic change much more easily than if you're dealing with it through a piece of legislation. How are you finding, or where might there be sweet spots where activists are also being educated in terms of understanding social justice and not just reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as getting the kinds of, the issues about what is really at the heart of a lot of the damage is capitalism, is growth, is colonization, is all of that kind of, extractivism, etc. Where can those sweet spots be so that we get the practicality also from the research side? We don't have time to play around. We really need to get to the heart of the serious change that has to happen. Plus, how can we get from the activist side a better understanding of how to open up minds so that we really go to the heart of the problems?
Did you want, that was partly addressed to you, but so.
I'm happy
Yeah,
to start
yeah.
to answer it, but I don't know if I have an answer for the question, but, that's a profound question I think we're all seeking to answer. I could maybe just speak about it in the project I've been working on in the past 2 years with my collaborator, Charles Stankovich, and we're doing we've put up an exhibition and doing a conference next week, or a symposium next week, hosted at U of T at the architecture one Spadina, if you're interested to join. But the intention of that conference is to bring contradictory perspectives and difficult conversations in one space, so to be really interdisciplinary. So we are really the catalyst for the entire project is really looking at solar geoengineering and the activism and pushback that's been seeing. But also we've invited David Keith, who is the lead scientist on solar geoengineering, to be around the same table having these difficult conversations and saying, well, of course, it is not solely a technological solution for climate change, and we need to think about it through a cultural lens, and we do need to think about it in our everyday experience of the world and our atmosphere and our sky and the future of our planet. So I think the ambition, hopefully within the scope of the work that at least I do, is to bring different perspectives around the same table, to draw an urgency, but make sure that urgency doesn't throw us back in the same loop that has caused the same issue. And I think to be sensitive and to be able to hear everyone out. But of course, a huge part of that conversation is governance. And I think at the end of the day, this is what we probably suffer most, especially under sort of our global conditions today. There seems to be difficulty to reach any sort of a consensus for basic human rights, let alone more complex questions of the future. So I think, so how do we come and speak about these things under the current conditions? But I do have to say, I personally have a very optimistic lens. I think that we can move beyond it. So I do believe art and activism still has a huge role to instigate concrete, real, literal change. And I think this is why we do what we do. But maybe I'll let you also answer that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a few things. Like it's a complex question. How do we think about this by way of activism, and rather than just sort of a sweeping diagnostic, and also in some ways like the myopia of GHGs or something like that. So I am always conscious of there's a book called Red Alert by Daniel Wildcat, who's pretty critical of even the United Nations, sort of identifications of what the problems are, and and his criticism is that it's very economic, right? This is to create the emergency is to actually push people to do X, Y, Z, because otherwise there won't be enough resources. And the Indigenous critique of that is that it actually just entrenches the apparatus in the first place through the economy. So what's a counter to that? Well, in Greenland, the activist organization Uraninamik is, that is about uranium and what the open pit mine would do to the township. But like, it was so controversial because, and it's controversial in lots of ways. The township wants the money from the mine. There's already rare earth mineral mines and other, like Greenland, other things that are mined there are rubies. There's other kinds of stone, other kinds of geological resources. They looked for oil, didn't find it. And so now, rare earths are pretty important, but rare earths in this particular location, it's just, you can't, there's also thorium, highly radioactive. So Quantrasut is actually a very radioactive mountain. And so, but it's also that the mine that was proposed it's like from the 60s. So, there's the hope that, and there's also a story about, maybe with AI we could do, we could mine differently or something like that, but that is not what's been on the table. It's like a cheap mine and no environmental or like minimal environmental responsibility, and basically the township, the people would have to leave. And so, that project has been quashed by the Greenlandic Parliament, or it's been paused for 5 years, and they're hoping it'll just sort of, there'll be, it's very complicated. The Energy Transition Minerals, the company actually took Denmark and Greenlandic parliaments to litigation because they were using the momentum. They said we've already done the research with a view to getting the extraction permit, and we have a right. In a sense, they're arguing we have a right to capitalize on our own research. So we've put the money in to research. This is where we should all be aware. Okay, research has that momentum, and that it's self-justifying somehow. So, but people want, Greenlanders they're optimistic about the future. There's a generation that are like, could we stop talking about, hunting and fishing, for goodness sake? We need an economy and we need to be connected to the world, and that's a reality. That's important. So the activist organization is not the end of the story in terms of how to think about climate change, but also for whom are we, who is inheriting the world, and what kind of world are they inheriting, and how could they think about it, and what would be a good way to think about it. So there's a sense in which it's like, yes, Greenland is entering onto the world stage, the world economy, and all of that stuff, but not. Actually, the Inuit Circumpolar Council and other Inuit organizations are really, they have strong voices that do not separate environmental justice from Inuit justice. So there's good stuff, is what I'm saying. And we should not, this is where, again, it's important to not abstract. Abstract in the sense of what's our goal vis-a-vis climate action or something like that.
Any last questions? Well, Amanda, thank you so much for being at OCAD and for. Oh, was there? Oh, I'm sorry. One last question.
Yeah.
You mentioned ecological justice,
Yeah.
and then you touched a little bit upon, I think, Ala, you also touched a little bit upon forensic architecture. So I was just wondering, like, forensic architecture as being the module of justice in this case, how do you see forensic architecture doing that for different environments?
So I would say they are one model of justice, and not necessarily the one that I'm working with, but that they're like a pretty dominant one. But basically what they do is, I would say they foreground what many people would chalk up to be a kind of like just a disaster. So they actually pull out, they're like, no, this actually wasn't a disaster. So each artwork that they have is a case that they took on. They're hired by activist organizations or humanitarian organizations to investigate. And so they investigate, okay, what happened here? And it might be some kind of toxic dumping. It might have been, say, a capsized ship full of displaced people who were trying to get into Europe, or, that's forensic oceanography. That was a particular case. So there are different ones, or like maybe some companies set fire, like created a fire that would move people so that they could actually seize the land. So they do a lot of stuff that relates to the movement of people, the seizing of land, the besiegement of people. They're doing a lot of cases related to Gaza right now, but they've been doing that all along too. So how does it bring justice? Well, I think many of us, we still think in categories, like, okay, well, that's the environment, or, like, it's almost like when we identify something like climate change, we say, okay, that's a very big problem, and we can see all these symptoms, but we can put everything under that umbrella, and that doesn't necessarily do too much. But what they'll do is be like, okay, well, that wasn't just innocent. There were decisions that were being made, and we can track the decision being made. We can track the point at which this country and this private company that was hired to take on the securitization of the shoreline actually didn't take the call from this ship that was sending a mayday signal and let them capsize, and these people died. We can calculate that down to the moment, and then they'll be like, here was your big moment, and you didn't do anything. So things that, I think often about negligence is hard to. So if we're thinking about climate action, okay, let's do something. But actually, what forensic architecture does really well is show something that's the negative space of action, like a negligence. And they'll be like, you didn't do anything. You could have done something, but did not do something. And we can see that by putting all the pieces together. We've got maps, we've got data, we've got this, this communication, we've got this, and they put it together. They'll put together a picture of what went down in this particular, and so it models itself on like a legal case, but it's using, they're great. So that's the sense of justice. It's like sometimes justice is not like proving somebody guilty, but proving everybody negligent, and proving it. We knew this, but we didn't do anything. But this is more what I'm doing is like, we could know differently. Let's know differently. Let's experience the world differently and then see what happens. It's a different way of thinking about justice.
Thank you.
I see, yeah.
I'm really fascinated by what you shared in terms of mapping the negligence and how to make that visible so that those stories are seen, so that ahead of time, just like disaster risk reduction when mitigating against floods and forest fires, people can go, oh, I've seen this pattern before, this is my moment of action, and now I know what to do. Like, what are ways to tell those stories? Like, what are pathways, and which are the audiences that would need to see it?
That's a good question for an artist. I mean, I mean, what I've seen, I don't know, Ala can maybe speak to this too, because that's, in some ways, I think often how, you know, organizations like United Nations will be like, we know, like this is the prelude to a genocide. We know this situation is leading up to a genocide, and then it's happening. Well, you know, so it's, in some ways, this is the inadequacy of knowing. Knowing doesn't lead to action necessarily. And even if we, you know, we might not want it to. Like, what are you gonna, you know, what are you gonna do? Different kinds of action, different ways of thinking. So I mean, I can't. So in some ways, I refuse to answer for the artist who's going to come along and say, and come up with something good about how to act differently once I know. But I can say that I've been quite taken with this thing. Like, well, now that I know that, I can't unknow it. And in some ways, like, that's why my origin point is like, I heard about Annie Poutigu and I was like, nope, can't put that one down. Don't know what to do, but can't put that one down. That's, things have gone wrong here if that happened. So there's that.
I think it's really well said, and I think it is perhaps through artworks. I mean, one of the pieces in the Shaping Atmospheres exhibition is a work by Richard Moss, who's returned to the Amazon, and it's actually capturing this entangled complexity. So it's not just saying that we need to know, and that knowledge doesn't actually change anything, but how do we start to untangle these things, like the involvement of deforestation and forest fires in the Amazon, but also, you know, indigenous cattle farming and the purpose for like clearing of land and all the cultural and technological and infrastructural complications that are sort of meeting at the nexus in Amazon. And so how can we step back and through the lens of art making and following this narrative come to terms with it and maybe start to be able to untangle some of these interdependencies or dependencies that seem to be perpetuating this sort of catastrophe in the Amazon. So I don't know, I feel there's no simple answer, and definitely knowledge is not, hasn't resonated as a solution, and it's not a simple key, but perhaps this kind of different way of knowing, shedding new light is a small way forward.
We've got snacks, everyone.
Yes, exactly. We've got snacks, and thank you so much, Amanda, for being here.
Thank you, Ala. Thank you. This is a good conversation. Thank you all. Thank you.